Welcome to Afrobeat Radio. You're listening to Ann Garrison joining us over the phone with her guest, Black Star News contributor Michael Kirkpatrick.
Thank you. Michael Kirkpatrick here is something of an expert in one of the subjects that we wanted to talk about, which is faux humanitarian militarism and the creation of citizen lobbies for them. And Michael is particularly familiar with this in regard to northern Uganda. Michael, are you there?
I'm here, Ann.
Could you just start by saying something about a genocide that we haven't heard about, hardly known at all in the West? That's the one that Michael is really familiar with, the Acholi Genocide. Could you tell us something about that?
Yeah,
Michael?
First of all, I'd just like to kind of introduce myself to your audience. I do not represent any NGO, any charity, any government, any business interest. I am not a missionary. My background and my experience in East Africa is purely from visiting friends and traveling, witnessing with my own eyes, and hearing with my own ears. I want to make this clear that I have absolutely no agenda for saying what I'm sharing with you. I have no agenda, no financial interest. There is absolutely no income that I am benefiting from sharing this information with your audience. I have traveled to Uganda frequently since 1998. My wife and I were personally invited by a Ugandan friend to come and visit him. That initial visit to Uganda really opened my eyes to what I was witnessing and seeing on the ground, again, just in Uganda. I can't speak for the rest of Africa, just I can speak for my own experience in Uganda. What I witnessed and what I saw was very different than what I was being fed through the media in the U.S., whether it's network television, whether it's through magazines, the publishing industry, or even through the internet. In 2007, this was my fifth trip to Uganda. Since 1998, I've traveled to Uganda 7 times. My last visit to Uganda was in November of 2010. In 2007, I was invited by an Acholi friend of mine to visit northern Uganda. Now, I was unaware of the issues in northern Uganda other than when I told my friends in Uganda. I was primarily in the south. My visits had been restricted to the south, to Kampala, and to southern villages and southern towns. When I told my friends that I was planning to travel to the north, there was a lot of fear and worry and concern over my safety. That's when I did some research to try and understand what their concern was for me, and that's where I learned about the war that was going on in the north. I found resources online. I learned about, groups like Invisible Children who were doing charitable work in the north and things like that. My experience traveling there was seeing a region of Uganda that was emerging out of war. I had learned about Lord's Resistance Army. I had learned about its leader, Joseph Kony. I had learned about the history, the genesis of this conflict, which went back into the mid-'80s. But then I also did research to understand just the history of Uganda and East Africa as a whole, going back to colonialism and things like that. But going to northern Uganda and seeing the IDP camps, the internally displaced persons camps, seeing the suffering, the struggling, these camps were erected and constructed by the Ugandan government under the guise of protecting the population of the north. For those that don't understand, there was civil unrest. There was basically a civil war that was being fought in northern Uganda between the Ugandan government forces and primarily the Lord's Resistance Army, led by Joseph Kony. The government, in order to, quote-unquote, protect Ugandan citizens, decided to take about 80% of the population of the north and herd them, in my opinion, like animals into these camps. And this process began in probably the early to mid-'90s. And these camps were lacking, any sort of sewage, food supply, medical care, people were put in these camps for their own safety, yet they were there suffering. And much to the ignorance of the West, who did not know about this going on, through, I believe, a plan of attrition, these people were not explicitly murdered or killed or sent to gas chambers, but because of the poor hygiene and the rampant disease, there was a pretty plain strategy to exterminate the Acholi people in northern Uganda. And this went on for years without any international attention.
Some people in Acholi land have described this to me as Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni's war on the north, and said that Joseph Kony provided a convenient excuse for it, that when he said he was going after the Lord's Resistance Army, he was really going after the people of Acholi land.
Yeah, and talking to people, I got that sense too. Now, again, I am not an apologist or a defender of Joseph Kony or the Lord's Resistance Army. I need to make that very clear. Of course, there are atrocities committed. There are crimes committed. Whether you're kidnapping children, whether you are terrorizing people with raids at night, whether you're raiding their food supply, because as a rebel force, you need to eat, and you can't just walk up to McDonald's and get your food. The primary source of food supply is either going to be food that is dropped from planes by the World Food Program into these camps. And I had many times heard from people saying that when they heard the engines of planes who they knew were coming with food drops, instead of making people feel a sense of relief and rescue, they felt a sense of horror and terror because they knew that a rebel raid was going to be imminent. So there was issues of food security. Now,
well, wait a sec. Let me see if I understand that. They knew that if the World Food Program dropped the food, the rebels would come after it, and they'd be hurt. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Okay. Because the World Food Program plane was like a beacon to rebels, in the nether regions, hiding that there was food to be had. So the issue of food security was a very serious issue where, humanitarian agencies were supplying sacks of food, but they weren't supplying the security for the people. Now, part of the issue with the government of Uganda sending troops to protect people who had been herded into these camps were reports of atrocities also committed by the National Army of Uganda. Those reports were very common. So what we have here is this isn't a case of two forces where one force is bad and the other force therefore must be good. This isn't a battle of good and evil, of right and wrong. This happens to be a case where you have bad. Both sides are committing atrocities, but only one side is being reported.
And the U.S. government was at that time backing the Museveni government and arming the UPDF, the Ugandan People's Defense Force. What are the years that the war in the north went on, the war putatively of the Ugandan army against the Lord's Resistance Army?
That war, you kind of have to go back to the ascension of President Museveni to power in Uganda. With much of the power struggles in Africa historically, there's coups, there's overthrows. Here in America, we don't really understand the conflicts between a government and its military. Here, our president is the head of the military. We kind of think of, as the military being loyal to the government. In many parts of the world, the military is independent. Well, in Uganda, after Idi Amin, there was a power struggle. A previous president, who Amin overthrew, Milton Obote, he came back to power after Idi Amin. Well, of course, there was a lot of disagreements and a lot of anger about Obote coming back to power. And Museveni had been preparing for years in the bush in western Uganda to overthrow the Obote government. Museveni fought the Bush War against Obote. He succeeded in the war and came to power in 1986. Now, he came to power not out of democratic rule or by the ballot. He came to power by the bullet. And that's not unusual for that time in Africa or in much of the world.
I want to focus on this time in the camps. How long were these camps in operation. How long did these camps exist?
Camps were established in the mid-1990s. There became a point where the unrest in the north and the reports of bloodshed or rebel raids was being reported. I don't know what instigated this strategy, but somebody within the Ugandan government thought, hey, there's civil unrest going on in this huge part of our country. Why don't we build these camps and herd the entire population of this large section of our country into these very small, tiny, disease-ridden, horrible camps, and we'll keep them there and tell them it's for their own good. That happened about the mid-90s. So these camps were built by the Ugandan government to, quote-unquote, protect its civilian population in the north. So from the mid-90s until now, my first trip to Uganda, or my first trip to the northern part of Uganda, where I actually went into 2 IDP camps, happened in 2007. So I'd say the camps had existed for about 10 years by the time I got to visit one of these camps and witness the conditions firsthand.
Why has the Acholi Genocide been so ignored? Why is the Rwanda genocide and the Darfur genocide, if that's the appropriate word for it? I'm not a scholar about Darfur. I don't really know what the appropriate word is for it, but the tragedies in Rwanda and Darfur are well known in the West. Why do you think those 2 examples of mass atrocities have wound up in this Pentagon manual and not that in Acholi land, which many say was even worse than Darfur?
There's a lot of politics and a lot of economic interest going on. The Darfur issue and the Rwandan issue, we can implicate, or people that document the history can implicate leaders or former leaders. So in Darfur, we can implicate and we can demonize al-Bashir. Now, again, I'm not an apologist or defender of al-Bashir, but he can be propped up and say, look, Darfur is the fault of al-Bashir. The same in Rwanda. It's a battle of good and evil, of right and wrong. So previous leaders before Kagame can be propped up and say, aha, these people were responsible for the genocide in Rwanda. It's a very easy narrative. If you have a narrative that can just say it's cut and dry, good, bad, right, wrong, if you can tell a story in that narrative, it's easy for public consumption. Now, in Uganda, that story is very complicated, especially when you have a darling of the West basically committing genocide. You can't come in and say, well, we've got all kinds of interests in your country, but geez, you're slaughtering your own people. There's a lot of political fallout from that. So the scapegoating of rebel forces, pointing the finger and saying, well, geez, yes, there are atrocities, but it's all them. It's all the LRA. It's all this Lord's Resistance Army. They are 100% responsible for every single criminal act, atrocity, and death and drop of blood. That is too easy of a narrative to tell, yet people have fallen for it. People have fallen for it hook, line, and sinker. Because with global politics, we can't go and implicate the leader of Uganda in a slaughter of his own people.
This is because he's been a U.S. ally. He's been backed by the U.S., which has used his country basically as a beachhead for its military operations in Africa and used his soldiers, right?
Absolutely, because you have to understand, too, that a lot of this was being uncovered. We have to go back to the magic date of September 11, 2001. Global politics and global warfare and interests all over the world changed on that date. We had to strategically figure out how to conduct this, quote-unquote, war on terror. East Africa is very strategic to fighting that war. East Africa is the crossroads of the Middle East, of Africa, of the sub-Asian continent. It is the crossroads.
Let's turn to Sudan and the Lord's Resistance Army. Milton Alamati, in some previous work on KPFA and WBAI, said that he believes that the LRA Disarmament Act, which you and I have talked about, which establishes a military project of the Uganda People's Defense Force, the Ugandan Army, in partnership with the DoD, the CIA, the DIA, that's the Defense Intelligence Agency, CARE International, the multinational nonprofit aid corporation and government contractor, and USAID, that Milton has said that that project is really about securing oil in northeastern Congo and southern Sudan.
And you mentioned, the magic three-letter word, oil. The West, especially America, we survive, we exist on petroleum products and petrochemicals and gasoline for our gas tanks. We just have a hunger and a thirst for gasoline and petrol. What you left out of that explanation when you're talking about oil reserves in southern Sudan and in eastern Congo is the huge amounts of oil reserves in Uganda. Geologists knew about these huge reserves for years. There are, I believe there's an Irish oil company and a Canadian oil company, Heritage and Tullow, who have successfully extracted oil from these huge reserves in Uganda. Now, the challenge now is distribution and logistics to get that oil to market for processing. But there are huge reserves of oil in Uganda. Because of the conflicts that you see emerging out of the Middle East and in northern Africa, you can see that strategically the ones that we get involved in, like Libya, and the ones that we ignore, like Syria, it very simply boils down to resources. What is in it for us?
This idea, using drones to stop genocide, was used to argue for the NATO invasion of Libya and dropping Tomahawk cruise missiles. Samantha Power, who is now seems to be Barack Obama's principal foreign policy advisor, made this argument, and stopping genocide is her principal human rights campaign.
Yeah, and I'd have to say that with those type of idealistic kind of missions, and I'll throw in there the Satellite Sentinel Project, which George Clooney has been well known for promoting and marketing. These drone programs and these satellite projects, if their intention is to prevent genocide, then they're a complete failure. Because what have they done to prevent bloodshed?
Michael, I think we need to wrap up considering the time. Is there anything you'd most like to say to wrap up here?
Well, I would encourage people, again, there's a great resource at your fingertips. The wire or the wireless that comes into your house, into your computer, is a great resource for anybody to do research. Take the time, research these things, cross-reference information. If you see things on the television, if you see things reported in print media, if you hear people talking, if you see protesters somewhere, have a sense of curiosity to look into it deeper. I'm not saying that everybody has to be interested in these topics, but if you are, please utilize resources to do research. There are some great sources out there that have no agenda.
Thank you very much to Michael Kirkpatrick and Ann Garrison from California. This has been Afrobeat Radio. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next week, Saturday.